Thank you, John. Well, I've been looking forward to this for quite a while now, and thinking about how we'll proceed the next 4 days. But a few of you said that you've been to China. What year did you first go? So like early 2000s? Last year, okay. And when did you first go?
I think it was late 80s. Is when they were going with the arms.
Late 80s. Have you been back more recently?
No. I don't think I want to.
Okay. Well, things have changed. Things have changed quite a lot. China is, well, before I go to that, let me just mention that, again, to thank the Ray Society for allowing me to have the opportunity to talk about a subject that is of enduring interest to me and to meet all of you. I should say this is not my first involvement with the Ray Society. In 2004, I had the chance to travel with the Ray Society group to China. We spent 3 weeks there. It was led by Professors Judy Allen and Joseph Snyder. I was more of a tag-along, but one of the real treats was that Governor Ray and his wife Billy were on the trip. And everything went really well, even though we started our day at 7 in the morning and we would roll into the next town at 10 at night. Professor Allen did not want to waste a minute of our time there, so after 3 weeks, we were pretty exhausted. But the only problem that we had was that we were always running behind, and the main reason for that is that Governor Ray is a shutterbug. He loves to take pictures, and so we would always be, well, let's move on. No, Governor Ray's taking more pictures. So he took, I don't know how many thousands of pictures, but it was quite impressive. Actually, he had been, interesting story. When Richard Nixon visited China in the early 70s and met with Mao Zedong said, we would like to invite local state and municipal leaders from the United States to come visit China. And so this was after Nixon had resigned, but later, a year and a half, 2 years later, a delegation did go to China, and Governor Ray was part of that delegation. And so one of the things that delegation did, besides to meet with Joe and I, was to visit the Forbidden City. And this was before the Forbidden City had been reopened to the public. So they were one of the few outsiders to have the chance to actually see the Forbidden City at that point in time. So for Governor Ray, that 2004 trip was a chance to revisit and see how China had changed. My first chance to visit China was in 1996. My whole family and I went to Nanjing, China. It used to be called Nanking, you may remember. Nanjing is about 100 kilometers west of Shanghai on the Yangtze River. And it's a substantial city, although it's not considered very big by Chinese standards. At the time, it was about 6 million people. But it used to be, actually in the 1930s, it was the capital of China under the nationalist Kuomintang government for a time. And in ancient days, it was also for a time the capital. But we spent a year there. I was teaching in a program, a graduate program co-sponsored by Johns Hopkins University and Nanjing University for Chinese and American graduate students. So there were 50 students, half of them were Chinese and half American, and they actually roomed together. And then the Chinese took courses from American faculty and taught in English, and then the American students took courses in Chinese taught by Nanjing University faculty. It was a really special year. It was probably one of the best years of my life. And I'm still in touch with some of my former students from those days. And there's one in particular who's a professor now at Fudan University of Shanghai. I always make sure to visit him when I go back. And when I do, my most recent visit was about a year and a half ago, and China has changed so much. I can remember in '96 on National Day, we got a train at 10:30 at night, and we were going to Suzhou, and we got on at the originating station, and we didn't think that, well, first of all, you can go, sort of first class or just, regular economy class. And we said, well, we don't need first class, we can go economy class. And so we got economy class seating, and well, the train filled right away, and there were people standing in the aisles, every inch of any open space. There were, I think, 3 people packed into the seat, with us, and then 3 people across the table. And of course, everyone's smoking. And then there are people actually in the baggage racks up above. There are people laying in the baggage racks. People coming in and out through the window. And at every stop, there were like hundreds of young people trying to get on the train. So when we got to Suzhou, and my wife and I had to push, through people to get to the door, and then the guy at the door said, he's not going to open it because it was already full, and if he opened it, then all these hundreds of young people would try to push into the train. And so, but we said, yeah, but this is our stop. This is where we need to get off here. And finally, the other people around us started yelling at him to let us off. And he opened the door enough so we could kind of squeak out. But we thought we didn't know where we'd end up if we hadn't made our way off the train. The last time I went, on the other hand, I went on a train that, a fast train that actually is a maglev train in Shanghai that goes over 200 miles an hour. I felt like I was in NASCAR or something. So that's the difference, between then and now. It's quite amazing. So what I'd like to do today is to look at this question of can China rise peacefully, assessing risks in U.S.-China relations. It's not a very nice topic, can China rise peacefully. People like me who study international politics are paid to think about the worst things that could happen and how we might be able to avoid them. We don't want to think about the possibility of war or conflict, and yet, we do need to understand it.
You're echoing here a little bit.
Okay.
Is there any way to deal with that?
Jenny, should I try putting this lower or something?
Maybe it might.
Okay, we'll see. Is it any better?
Of course, seats up here.
Okay, maybe the room. Okay.
Okay. And I'm used to speaking loud. My wife always says, quiet down. So we had to think about these issues, whether we'd like to or not. And the U.S. and China, we do worry about one another, even though we have so many ties that bring us together, so many benefits of the relationship. But nevertheless, there are worries. This is how the Chinese sometimes see the United States. And this is how Americans sometimes worry about China. So, we're interdependent. We're sort of, a term young people use, frenemies. We're both friends and enemies, perhaps. Now, the question that we're going to focus on, can China rise peacefully, has been discussed by, particularly by a Harvard scholar named Graham Allison. He had a piece in the Atlantic a couple years ago. And he used the term Thucydides trap. Does anybody know who Thucydides is?
What's the story?
And what did he chronicle?
Peloponnesian Wars.
That's right. So he was looking at the warfare on the Greeks, among the Greek city-states, particularly Athens and Sparta. And the way he summarized the cause of that war was that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this inspired in Sparta that made war inevitable. So the argument here is that the maximum danger of great power war comes when there's an existing dominant state whose dominance is threatened by the rise of another power. And it's at that point when the transition is taking place, this crossover point, that the maximum danger occurs. It could be that the dominant power would prefer a preemptive war to prevent the rising power from overtaking it, right? While it still has the strength to assert its dominance. On the other hand, it may be that once the rising power has overtaken the previously dominant country, the rising power wants to remake the system in its own image, and that prompts war. Either way, the argument is that this is a danger point. Now, Allison and a team of scholars at Harvard have carried out a historical project. They've looked at 16 cases where there was a rising power that overtook a dominant power, either a globally dominant power or a regionally dominant power. They found that in 12 of those 16 cases, the transition led to war. Now, in 4 cases, it did not. One, for example, is the U.S. Replaced Britain as the world's greatest power in the early 20th century. Did not lead to war, at least between those two countries. Didn't lead to war. Now, one of our leading scholars of international relations is John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago. Mearsheimer has written quite a bit about China's rise. And he's a pessimist. He argues that China cannot rise peacefully. He bases this up from what we call a realist theoretical standpoint. Realists believe in realpolitik, that states are self-interested actors, that they seek power and dominance, and that war is a common occurrence in international politics. Not an aberration, but it is a recurring phenomenon. Now, notice he says that he's not arguing that it's just that it's an aggressive China that's necessarily going to lead to war or conflict. The ways in which the United States reacts to China could as easily be the source of war and conflict. So we have to look at both sides of that. Now, not all scholars are that pessimistic. There is a gentleman named John Ikenberry at Princeton who's written also a lot about this, and he's a little bit more optimistic. He is what I would call a liberal institutionalist as opposed to a realist. He thinks that norms and institutions in the international politics help to moderate raw power-seeking and competition. That institutions can nudge states toward mutually beneficial cooperation. So from his standpoint, China's rise is taking place in the context of a set of what he calls liberal institutions created by the U.S. and its allies after World War II that are, he says, easy to join and hard to overturn, so that China has strong, China can benefit from joining this liberal order, and in fact has benefited, perhaps is the greatest beneficiary of this liberal order. And at the same time, it would be very difficult, because it is so deep and pervasive, to overthrow this order. So China has very few incentives to actually try to carry out, radical change. So from his standpoint, China has no incentive to engage in behavior that would lead to conflict involving war. Now, by the end of this course, I would like us to have some, you know, some sense of the strengths and weaknesses of these contending arguments. But we're not going to jump right into the debate itself. We're going to try to set the stage a bit. So, in today's class, we're going to just ask the question, is China overtaking the U.S.? If so, in what ways? On what time scale? Is it across the board, or is China's rise stronger in some areas than others? So we'll talk a little bit today. We'll look at the data. Then another question is, you know, not just countries' power, but their purpose. What kind of world do they want? And that's really shaped a lot by their values and their national identity. So the next meeting, we're going to look at what are the underlying values and identity of Americans and Chinese, and where do they sync up and where do they conflict. So we're particularly looking at how geography, political culture, and institutions have shaped values and identity on both sides. So that gives us a sense of, first of all, what are the capabilities of these two states, and then what are the aims of the values of these two states. The third class will focus on two flashpoints. There has to be you can have kindling and you can have oxygen, but you still need a spark to start a fire, right? What are the potential sparks out there? We won't be able to look at all of them, but we'll look at a couple, particularly Taiwan and the South China Sea. And as you know, if you read the news, we might not have talked about Taiwan as being an immediate flashpoint, but we're forced to do so now. And then finally, we'll come back to the big question that we started with. Where is this relationship going? What are the risks? And can we escape the Thucydides trap? Because even Mearsheimer, who's ultimate realist and pessimist, doesn't believe that either side wants war or would even benefit from war. But there are many wars that have occurred in history, even though no one actually intended that to be the outcome. All right, does that sound interesting? Or? Yeah. Okay. Now, one of the things that I want to invite is for you to interrupt me with questions. I've been told that you guys are good at that. So please feel free. In fact, it's much more interesting that way. And then I'm always going to leave time at the end also for questions. And if you don't have questions, well, I can pose some questions to you. But my guess is that you'll probably have your own questions. So let's begin by looking at the economic, technology, society side. We'll look at some comparisons between U.S. and China. And I just love data, so this is fun for me. So China, as you probably know, under Mao Zedong, was basically cut off from much of the world during the 50s through the 70s, under what the disastrous Great Leap Forward, the equally disastrous Cultural Revolution. China even had, by the early 60s, cut ties with the Soviet Union, which during the 50s originally their common commitment to communist ideology had brought them together, but that wasn't strong enough to overcome other reasons for conflict. So China was so isolated, and Mao had this idea of self-sufficiency, that's how countries rise in national greatness and power, is to be self-sufficient, right? Because you don't want to depend on anybody else. Once Mao died, Deng Xiaoping came to power and had a very different approach. For one thing, he was much less ideological. He said, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. In other words, pragmatic. Don't worry about ideology, worry about the results. And he realized that China was way behind and falling further behind as time went on. So he decided to experiment. He really didn't have he didn't know exactly where it would go, but he decided to try experimenting. And one of the things he tried was open up China to the world. So U.S.-China normalized relations, but China also opened itself to trade, opened itself to investment, and began taking advantage of the idea that countries actually become prosperous by specializing in producing a certain range of goods that they have what's called a comparative advantage in, that they are particularly well suited to produce within the global economy, and then import for things that other countries can produce more efficiently. And that became the approach. And so China started a growth process that is the most amazing in human history. First of all, the last 250 years have been amazing in themselves because prior to that, economic growth rates were a fraction of 1%. For thousands of years, the progress within a lifetime was not discernible. For the Industrial Revolution, basically the exploitation of fossil fuels allowed exponential rise in growth rates. But even in the 19th century, countries rising by 1.5%, 2%, that was considered revolutionary. Then you had, after World War II, you had in Asia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, the other Asian countries, they grew very rapidly. But again, nothing like China. First, because how rapid China's growth was, and second, none of them had 1.3 billion people. We look at other countries that have 20 or 40 or 60 million people. This is 1.3 billion people, 1 out of every 5 humans on Earth. And so, for a country like that, over 40 years to sustain a growth rate of close to 10% per year, really amazing. You can see here, many years, the growth was even above 12% for a number of years in the 80s and the 90s, as recently as 2006. Now you do notice that in recent years, the growth has started to decline, and most of 2014, it looks like it's about a little over 7%, as opposed to 10 and 12%. More recently, it's dropped even below 7%. So it's on the way down, but to have sustained that for so long is really revolutionary. Totally transformed the lives of Chinese. Probably 600 million people were raised out of poverty. It's an extraordinary accomplishment, and people wonder, well, how can the Chinese, put up with living under communist rule? They have something to show for it, actually. So it's not that big a mystery. Now, again, when I was an undergraduate, the idea of China overtaking the U.S. would have been laughable. But this is a chart put together by The Economist magazine, and it's I'm told I can do a little, see these little milestones? That's the year that China surpassed the U.S. And these are years in the future that China is projected to surpass the U.S. on these indicators. And this is the ratio of China to U.S. now. So for instance, steel consumption, 6.5 times what the U.S. is at, or local funds over 3 times, etc. So you can see that on many different measures, China is already surpassed the U.S. in size, and in other measures, it's approaching the U.S. These are 2 different ways of measuring gross domestic product, overall economic output. And you can see that China will, or will either has or will soon surpass the U.S. Defense spending is still ways out. It'll probably be almost another decade, according to this projection. Let's look at a few other indicators. So, gross domestic product measures a flow of resources or exchange in a given time period, a year, right? But wealth measures the accumulation of assets over, time. So, my house was built in the mid-40s, and it was counted as GDP when it was built, right? But once it's built, it's still there. I can still use it. It's part of our national wealth. So if you look at wealth rather than yearly income, the U.S. is still about 4 times as wealthy as China in total. You can look at a bunch of other measures here. Global Competitiveness Index, U.S. ranks higher. Financial competitiveness, U.S. ranks higher, although China is very close. It's number 3 out of 58. Foreign exchange earnings, China is number 1 because of its yearly trade surpluses. The U.S. is number 17. Quality of infrastructure, the U.S. is still ahead of China. Education is an interesting area. In higher education, the U.S. is still number 1 in the world. We have 11 of the top 20 universities. China has none. The top Chinese university is ranked 29, and that's in Hong Kong. The top mainland, Tsinghua, is rated 47. Scientific citations, U.S. is number 1. China is number 2, about half as many. But the U.S. is higher quality, 22 sites per document versus China's always less than 7. So our scientific studies are cited more often for study. Internet, U.S.'s penetration rate is still higher. This last one is a international test of high school students. Meant to test, their educational attainment. And here, out of 70 countries in science, China is 10, the U.S. is 25. In math, China is 6, U.S. is 40. In reading, China is 27, U.S. is 24. So when it comes to K-12, arguably, China's already ahead of us. Well-being. Well, actually, the U.S. surprisingly is not very good when it comes to environmental performance. We're only number 39, but China's much, much worse. It's 104. I could go on about China's environmental problems. They are horrific, really horrific. And it's one of its great national weaknesses, and could be a major hindrance going forward, actually. Freedom Index, U.S. is number 1, China's 181. That's also a hindrance. China restricts the internet heavily. That actually has implications for, the spread of knowledge and innovation is hindered by those kinds of controls. Global Well-Being Index, U.S. is 14 out of 155, China is 127. China's industrial might is not, improvement. Although people have risen out of poverty, if you look, for instance, at how much their health has improved, actually, the improvements have been much less than you might expect given the rise in their incomes. For various reasons, China has not prioritized social services and sort of welfare enhancing investments. It prioritizes manufacturing and infrastructure. Human Development Index, US is 12 out of 159, China's 81. China's gradually rising over time. The US, on the other hand, is going in the other direction. Reputation, how do other countries feel about the United States and China? That is a kind of what we call soft power, right? Our appeal of our system. Yes, sir?
How reliable are Chinese numbers?
Depends on what you're measuring.
Say economic numbers.
If you're measuring like coal or steel output, it's probably pretty accurate. When you get to the gross, domestic product numbers, it gets suspicious when every quarter it's 6.5% growth, and that was the target for the year.
Yeah. Some of those numbers have been refuted. That 10, 12% year after year after year. Now they look back and say, kind of caught you with your hand in the cookie jar.
Not really. I think what happens mostly is that they smooth out the numbers. So actually, some years the growth probably exceeds the targets, but maybe it understates the growth. The actual figures understate the growth, and in other years they exceed. But you don't have to just rely upon these kind of numbers to judge China's economic progress. You can just go to China and see it. You go to Shanghai, we have one skyscraper, more than 40 stories in our principal. They have maybe 10,000. It's just extraordinary. You can go to look at the Pudong region in Shanghai, which just a few decades ago was just rice fields, and now it's like one of the most stunning architectural. It's not just that they're big buildings. The best architects in the world are working in China's major cities. I'm not saying that all of their building is up to snuff, but I'm saying that the best buildings are the best in the world. But you're right, the incentive structures for lower level cadre are to exaggerate progress so that they can look good and get promoted. But at the same time, the government understands the necessity not to fool itself and to have some degree of accuracy. So I think what happens is the government steps in and kind of smooths out the numbers to make them, they want them to be roughly accurate, but I think there is some kind of intervention that goes on. So Q rating, favorable rating, you can see that the U.S. is a little bit more favorably viewed than China and most of the world, especially when it comes to personal freedoms. Corruption perceptions is that China is much more corrupt than the U.S., although number 19, I don't know if that's a lot to brag about. This is from The Economist. Let's see if I can get this up. So this is a pretty interesting little interactive chart. And it shows what they've done here is, you don't get to see it. Well, I don't know why it doesn't show up. I'll have to tell you what it is. Basically, they chart out Chinese growth versus American economic size over time, and show that China's economy surpasses the U.S. around this time, right? 2016, if you're looking at purchasing power parity numbers, 2018, if you're looking at exchange rate numbers. If you jiggle the assumptions about Chinese growth rates going forward and American growth rates, you get somewhat different, lines. Nevertheless, no matter what, we're certain that China's growth will continue to exceed the U.S. growth for quite some time. probably by 2050, China's economy overall size will be about twice that of the U.S. But the U.S. will still be, right now, per capita income in the U.S. is more than 4 times as high as China's, and it'll be probably at least twice as high in 2050. So on a per person basis, we'll still be considerably, our income will be twice as high. But remember, China has 4 times as many people. Yeah.
Could you comment on the ratio of national debt to GDP with China and that with the U.S.?
Interesting question. So, both have rising levels of debt. The U.S. level is, we worry about that sometimes. But China has had a very rapidly growing level of indebtedness in the past 8 years or so, and has now reached levels that are causing alarm, and is much higher than the U.S. level. And one reason for this is that China's growth has come more and more to depend upon government investment, particularly, not just government investment, but government sometimes pushing banks to make loans, politically motivated loans that commercial banks in the West wouldn't make. Because since 2008, in 2008 with the financial crisis, Chinese leaders felt they could not afford to allow a recession, and so they put in a stimulus package of $500 billion, which was in relative terms bigger than the U.S. package relative to the size of their economy. And a lot of that went into infrastructure and investment. And in order to keep the economy growing, they continued to push debt-led growth. The problem is that a lot of those loans are going into investments that are not going to pay off. They're bad investments, or they're investments whose return will not be sufficient to pay the interest or the principal. And so the number of bad loans on bank books is growing. Also, the amount of GDP growth you get from each dollar invested has declined. So the quality of investment is going down because you're not getting the bang for your buck that you used to. And partly it's because China's just, they have this enormously high savings rate, almost 50%. They actually have a This is savings rate. Kuwait and Bermuda are just tiny little economies. China, though, is the world's largest economy at this point. So almost 50% of national income is saved. Now, Japan and Taiwan and South Korea, they had high savings rates during their period of rapid growth, 30, 35%. Right, compared to the U.S. is maybe 18, 20%. Well, nothing like China. China's close to 50%. That's huge. And that's being funneled into investment. And again, there's only so much in the investment that the economy can actually absorb. So, have you seen any photos of these so-called ghost cities? These cities that have no people? Or trains to nowhere, or bridges that aren't needed, or it's just a way of trying to keep the economy moving, right? Through really what's wasteful investment. Yeah.
Does China, and particularly given the amount of investment that it has, does China have the ability to manipulate the U.S. investment and resulting debt process.
So one of if you want to read up on this, there's a guy named Michael Pettis, Pettis. He's the best guy on this. And what he points out is that one nation's excess of savings over consumption is another nation's excess of consumption over savings. That necessarily they tend to balance. They have to balance out. So if China is going to save more than it consumes, and the U.S. is going to do the reverse, then we're going to have a huge trade imbalance. And China's going to run a surplus, we're going to run a deficit. That's just how it works, necessarily. So when the Chinese choose to boost savings and investment at the expense of consumption, they are forcing a trade deficit on the U.S. And that had a lot to do with our financial crisis in 2008, because when China is running these huge surpluses, they are gathering American dollars, which are like little IOUs. Now, they're not spending them on our goods, because if they were, we wouldn't have a trade deficit, right? What are they doing? They're not just putting them under the mattress. They're sending them back into the U.S. economy at that time, particularly in treasury bills. That pushed down interest rates. When interest rates went down, people went crazy buying homes because it was cheap to buy a home. And that led to a lot of speculation and pushing up home values and assets and everything. So these things are always connected, and that imbalance, which both sides have responsibility for, has a lot to do with both sides having different kinds of problems.
Well, I haven't heard anything about agriculture. I know in the U.S., it's a small part of our employment in agriculture anymore. In China, it's quite a lot larger. So I guess the question I had around, what's the ramification of that? And two, it seems like for China, having recently, 20 million people starved in the 50s, agricultural policy seems to be a lot bigger. And I've heard that their corn price, for example, is subsidized a lot higher than it is in the U.S. Trying to work that through in terms of stability. Thoughts on their policy and what that
So one of the reasons that China was able to grow is that the original reforms were focused on agriculture. They had these communes, which were state-owned, huge enterprises that people were basically had no incentive. They had no possibility. Everybody got paid or fed the same and same housing. There was no possibility of bettering yourself as an individual by working harder, so nobody worked. And these were enormously inefficient. And when they finally shut down the communes and started what's called a household responsibility system, they didn't literally give ownership to families, but they gave them the right to work a piece of land, basically like a lease. And they also said, after you've fulfilled your quota for selling your produce to the state, then anything more that you produce beyond that, you could sell on the private marketplace, and then keep the profits from that. That set in motion a process that led to rapid increase in productivity on the farms. That first of all boosted farm incomes, and this was talking about the 1980s, very rapidly. Second of all, it freed up labor from the countryside that could be channeled into factories, right? So the initial winners from reform were the farmers. Later on, the farmers, starting in the 90s, where the investment was neglected and it was focused on manufacturing and infrastructure, and the farmers' incomes have fallen behind. Urban incomes about 3 times that of farm incomes. However, China still has been pretty efficient. If I can remember the numbers, I looked at this a few years ago. On wheat and soybeans, China was, their level of productivity per acre was about, at the world's top. It was basically as good as anybody. And the productivity per acre on corn was about middle. It's about the world average. So they had some ways to improve on corn, but on the other two basic staples, they were already at the top, which meant any improvement was going to be very slow and incremental. However, as China, its population is not growing, but more and more people are moving into middle class status. And one of the first things they do as they gain more income is add protein to their diet. They do that by eating meat or fish. And so that means that China's meat and fish consumption is growing very rapidly. And as you know, you can feed a lot more people by directly consuming grain than by feeding it to animals and then consuming meat. So what that means is that China's productivity increases on the farms are slow, but the increased demand for grain for meat consumption is rising, which is why China's going to import, already has begun, and will in the future import more and more grains from overseas, including from Iowa.
You mentioned how that China increased savings and brought more money into China, creating a deficit with the U.S., and then you related that to the 2008 or whatever it was, recession.
Yeah.
Was that something China did intentionally, or was it just a byproduct of what was happening?
It was intentional in the sense that China saw its growth as based upon exports, and they deliberately forced down the value of the yuan, their currency, so as to make their exports competitive. And also that when you do that, it also makes imports expensive in China. So they would export more and import less and run trade surpluses. That was very deliberate. And when Donald Trump says that China's a currency manipulator, he's right 10, 15 years ago. They were on a major basis. Today they're not, though. Today their currency, they're actually trying to stop the currency from falling in value, to sort of maintain the value, because the market's trying to push it down. The dollar is surging everywhere. So actually China's doing what we want them to do in a sense, but now, and so his accusations are out of date. But yeah, the way that China fueled this growth, again, they turned themselves into the center of world manufacturing. So this is a diagram that shows the flow of intermediary goods through supply chains in East Asia, and China plays a major role. Now, a lot of the goods that are produced in China are actually the parts that they were designed elsewhere, right? The parts came from elsewhere. They're just final assemblies in China because it happens to be most efficient to do it that way, and then it's exported. So the actual Chinese, when we import a good from China that's $600, and we think, oh, so what's $600 we're paying China? Well, China's turning right around and paying $595 of that to the parts, producers so they're only keeping maybe $5 of that $600. So actually, our trade deficit is more with Asia than it is with just China. You have to look at the whole picture. It's not one country producing all of the good and then another country producing all of the good and then trading. It's a global network that's broken up into these complex supply chains. But what China did is to say, we want to build out our niche in the global supply chain. And to do that, we're going to do several things. One, we're going to hold down wages. So we're going to repress wages. 2, we're going to hold down the return that savers get on their investment. So there's a lot of savings, but people aren't actually earning very much money. In fact, for many years, savers were actually, when you take inflation into account, they're actually losing money on their savings. And that was deliberate policy, suppressing interest rates, so that that savings could then be used to make cheap loans, so that basically companies could get cheaper credit in China than companies, their competitors could abroad. And then so the finance wages, and then consumption, that China did a variety of things to try to discourage consumption, so that people would save even though they're not getting much return on it. And that all freed up resources to funnel into infrastructure and manufacturing. Now, one reason that this can't go on forever is precisely what you're saying, that it's at the expense, it creates these huge imbalances that can't continue forever. And all of these bad investments that have been going on the last 8 years or so, as China forces banks to make unsound investments. The difference is that in the United States, commercial banks who are making loans that were not going to be paid back, that were bad loans, would be forced to declare that. They'd have to write those down on their balance sheet. Right? They'd have to acknowledge these are bad loans. We're not going to get paid back. We're going to, our accountant will record that, and then our profits will go down. In China, the government allows the banks to just keep, turning over those loans. So you have a loan to a manufacturer that's not going to pay back, and it comes due. Well, you just issue a new loan, and they pay back the old loan with the new loan, and you just keep doing that. So the amount of bad credit on the books doesn't get wiped clean, it just keeps accumulating. That's what Michael Pettis argues. So he says that you can, if you do that, you can jugger up your growth numbers to make them look pretty good. But they're hiding the fact that actually it's exaggerating the amount of growth that's actually taking place. And you'll actually see that those loans can't be hidden or staved off forever. But this is how China did it. It moved from plan to market. It broke up the communes. It focused on export. It welcomed FDI, foreign direct investment, not important so much for the capital that was brought in, but more for the technology and the managerial know-how and the connection to overseas marketing networks that brand name producers brought in. They repressed savings, wages, and consumption to boost investment, and they expanded and improved education. In the decade of the 2000s, China's higher education, the numbers of students in higher education expanded 5 times in less than a decade. Could you imagine that? Remember when the U.S. in the 60s had a big expansion of higher education? We built all these. It would be nothing compared to the rate of expansion in China.
Do you happen to know the rate of expansion in America after World War II?
I don't know what that rate is, but I know it wasn't 5 times. I mean, it was. It would have been much more moderate than that. I mean, it's extraordinary. Now, when you quintuple the size of the higher education sector, is the quality going to be, probably this, you're sacrificing some quality.
I would believe the point that if you were to isolate out the GI Bill, do you have to have a ballpark idea of what that?
I don't know. I don't have that. That's a great question. Does anyone have an answer to that?
Yeah, repeat the question.
So she was wondering, first of all, how rapidly did U.S. higher education expand in terms of student numbers in the couple of decades after World War II, and how much of that was funded through the GI Bill. I don't actually have those numbers. But it's a comparable kind of thing, right? That China's decided that the only way, so the big increase for China was moving people from very low productivity farming activities, where they're literally, hundreds of dollars a year, that would be all they're producing. From that into factory jobs. That one-time jump is a huge increase in the productivity for that worker. All right? And it doesn't require a lot of training. We were talking about unskilled assembly line work. However, over time, China's wages keep rising. And competition from overseas, from lower wage countries, keeps growing. Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma, Bangladesh. And so now, now factories are actually relocating out of China for those low-end, labor-intensive activities. So then where do you go? You have to move up the value chain and up the skill and technology chain and produce higher value-added, more technologically sophisticated goods that require higher skilled workforce. The only way to do that is to increase education levels, and that's what China's trying to do. However, 5 times in less than a decade, guess what's happened? The job opportunities for college graduates did not also increase 5 times in a decade. No way. I mean, even at China's rate of growth, they're not quintupling the number of jobs that require a college education in 1 decade.
Then they come over here and get programs to get doctorate.
Right, but what happened is that now college graduates have a harder time finding work than unskilled laborers, and sometimes don't get paid any better. And now you actually have a somewhat dangerous situation for the Communist Party, because you have a lot of well-educated young people who are really ticked off because they felt that higher education was going to be their ticket to a better life, and now they either can't find work or they're finding work far below what they expected, and either in status and pay, and they're not very happy about that.
In the 50s, I probably would have been jailed for even asking this question. But
you might be jailed today too. We'll see. We'll have to see.
We really don't have, to my knowledge anyway, a coherent industrial policy. And a lot of that is politics. And the fact that we're a democracy and we have confusing, conflicting views. For example, our expertise is in design. You never hear anybody say that on the political stage. When you look at this growth in China, is there a relationship between a political setting of a country and its economic growth? Is it possible that democracy actually holds economic growth back?
That's a great question. So if you just look at the studies that look at democracy versus authoritarian economic performance overall, what you find is democracies do better overall and in the long term. And of course, it's democracies that have that are at the top of the rich country tables. Now, whether it's democracy leads to economic growth or economic growth leads to democracy, see, that's another question. Which way is causation? But among those countries that are considered authoritarian, non-democratic, there are a wide variety of types. There are some that are predatory authoritarian governments, where you have a small elite that basically just, exploits the people below them. And it's just about getting whatever they can get out of the population. They have no interest in growth. Same thing, resource-rich states, they call it the oil curse, right? Where if you're the leader of South Korea, it has no resources. How are you going to get wealthy in a country like that? The only way is to make sure that the average people are well educated and working hard in factories and creating overall economic growth for everybody, so that as the whole country grows, then you grow as well. However, if you are a leader and here's an oil well, and that's the only real resource, that's the only real source of wealth the country has, and you happen to control it, and the consumers are in another country, and oil production doesn't require very many workers anyway, you can just control that oil well, sell it to other countries. You don't have any stake in whether anybody else in the country benefits or not. They're not contributing to your wealth and well-being. So, resource-rich countries often are not good economies. They are good for a few people at the top. However, in China is kind of interesting, because here's an authoritarian government. It is what we call a developmental state. Now, South Korea, Taiwan, their periods of most rapid growth were also under authoritarian type governments. It's only later that they became democracies. And developmental states are, as I said, even if whether you're democratic or not, if the only way to get wealthy is to make sure everybody in your society also gets wealthy, to industrialize, in other words, then, even authoritarian governments have an incentive to bring up the whole country. And that seems to be the case in China. There's plenty of corruption, but actually it's not unusually large for a country at that level of development. For that per capita GDP, the level of corruption in China is, about par for the course. It's just that it's 1.3 billion people, and so the size of the most corrupt figures at the top, the size of their fortunes is huge. But it's not just a dictator. It's not one dictator, right? It's not even just like the military rule or something, military junta. It's a party. It's a communist party. And that's probably about 1 in 10 people in China are members of the party. Maybe a little bit less than that. And so it's big enough so that the rulers are accountable to the party, and the party is big enough that the rulers have to satisfy a lot of people, and therefore they have to invest enough in public goods and overall economic growth to keep at least the party members happy, if not the population as a whole. So for whatever reason, China's particular brand of authoritarianism has been one where the state leaders have invested in things that help the economy as a whole grow, rather than just enriching themselves and forgetting about everybody else. And in fact, if you go to China, you go to the big cities, you don't see the big slums surrounding the cities in China that you would see in South America, for instance, or in Africa, right? Even those at the bottom, they're not well off by any means, but there's some basic floor.
In one of your earlier slides, you indicated that it was going to be a number of years before China caught up with U.S. in defense spending.
Yeah.
How does their manufacturing of defensive weapons and selling defensive weapons and so forth compare to the U.S.?
So let me I saw a number of hands up. Let me real quick run through some slides that deal with the military side, and then we'll come back and take questions. So, let's just see what we here. I covered some of this. China's going to have to reshape its economy to be more consumption-oriented, less savings and investment, more social welfare spending, growing service sector, less export dependence. And China is part of their plan. They know that. The problem is that their vested interests would benefit from the current arrangements, who are slowing that reform huge thing that we need to be aware of, is that China's birth rate is very, very low, way below replacement level. And it's not really because of the one-child policy. They've loosened that a little bit recently. It's not going to make much difference. All the countries around China also have birth rates well below replacement levels. So it's just part of the Asian shift in Asian culture. And so China's workforce, one reason that China grew so rapidly is that they had about 70% of the population was of working age. They had very few children and very few old people, dependent ages. That created what's called a demographic sweet spot that allowed very rapid growth. That's changing very rapidly. China's workforce is already shrinking. It's going to shrink at an accelerating pace. China's going to be, average age is going to be older than the US by mid-century. And China's overall population is going to be, the last half of the century is actually going to fall. The US population right now is 25% of China's. It's going to be 28% of China's by mid-century. And whereas China's population is falling, the U.S. population is going to continue to grow, assuming we don't adopt draconian immigration policies. And this is actually our historical, relative to other countries, openness to immigration and ability to assimilate immigrants. It's a major advantage we have over China. But it's one that we could easily mess up with the wrong policies. Okay, military power. The U.S. is number one. It's about 3 times as much as China. Our military spend is equal to 37% of the world total. You can see our arms deliveries are about 5 times as great as China's to other countries. This shows a graphical form the advantage the U.S. has. However, I just read today that Washington Post has a piece about all the waste in the U.S. Like there are 1 million people employed doing back office operations in the U.S. Defense Department. That's stunning. That's almost as many soldiers as we have. But anyway, China probably has similar problems, I would imagine. But look at this. It's not just, it's misleading to just compare U.S. to China straight out military spending. Because China's military spending has grown rapidly, you can see here. And whereas the U.S. is actually flat or actually declining because of sequestration. But the difference is that the alliance system the U.S. has around the world. The U.S. has troops in 120 countries, bases in 60, formal and informal defense commitments with 69 countries, 800 bases in 70 countries. China has 1 base overseas in Djibouti. It just opened its first base overseas. The U.S. has 11 aircraft carriers. China has 1. The U.S. has a huge technological lead. And we go to war a lot, so we get good at it. China doesn't go to war, so they're not used to it. This is our military presence abroad. This is on everything except manpower. The U.S. is pretty much ahead. China's military strategy. They are moving very rapidly to create. They're building a second aircraft carrier, expanding the submarine fleet. They invest a lot in missile and rocket technology, cyber and space warfare. They built a 5th generation fighter plane. So they're making rapid progress, but they have a lot of problems. For one, the United States is surrounded by Mexico, Canada, and 2 oceans. Look at China. 14 land borders, not to mention, the close by marine islands like Japan. 14 borders there. And they've gone to war with a number of these countries. They went to war with India several times. They've been to war with Vietnam. They've been to war with South Korea. They actually had military classes in the late 60s with the Russians. Well, they did a civil war with Taiwan. Of course, they've been to war with Japan. So, you know, China's neighborhood requires it to spread its military resources across all those potential threats. All their sea lanes are controlled by the U.S. Navy. They have no real allies except maybe North Korea. And they have points of military when they have outstanding military capabilities, but they have to assemble that into an ensemble that they've not mastered yet. Okay, so this is the big picture. What is the balance of power going to look like in this century? China's economy will be the largest in the world, may already be, but U.S. per capita GDP will be twice as large as in China, and the U.S. will retain a dwindling lead in its overall wealth. On security, the U.S. will remain the strongest military power overall, especially if you can count on alliances, but China will be a strong runner-up and possibly dominant in Asia itself. So, those are some, that's a picture of sort of where we're at, where we're likely to be going. So let me stop and ask for questions.
I'm going to get my numbers wrong, but you'll understand what I'm trying to ask. The Chinese Politburo that runs China, let's say it's got 100 members. I have no idea what the number is, but aren't like 50 or 60 or 70 of them the wealthiest people in China? I mean, the corruption just looks like it's, to me, as an outsider, it's overwhelming. That's an unusual number to see.
Yeah. Was it Forbes and Wall Street Journal? There were some major U.S. business publications that did an analysis of the wealth of some of the top Chinese leadership and found that looking at their families and cronies that they had amassed huge fortunes, and comparing, as you said, the National People's Congress to the U.S. Congress and their relative wealth. China's leaders parliamentarians are much wealthier. So that's all true. And actually, China's own leadership has often said that this is the greatest threat to the party's rule, that the party will become so corrupt within and so discredited among the population for corruption that it will disintegrate. That's one reason why Xi Jinping, the Communist Party leader and president, has mounted a major anti-corruption campaign. There are always, every few years they'll have anti-corruption campaigns. Usually they pick out a few examples and then don't get very serious. This is different. This is, first of all, they've gone after some people at leadership levels that are much higher than ever before, and it's much broader and deeper. Now, does that mean that it's being carried out according to a proper rule of law and where everybody gets treated equally? Probably those who are being targeted are more likely to be in opposing political factions and a threat to Xi Jinping's power. And there are political factions within the party. However, this has been made Xi Jinping very popular among ordinary people. They'd love to see some big high-level cadre, doing a perp walk, with his hands in hand stuffs and being embarrassed that way. they love the idea that, you know, Xi Jinping's out, you know, rounding up all these fat cats and put them in jail. So that's one of the things that one of the chief complaints people have, and since Xi Jinping is creating the appearance that he's doing something about it. Now, in order to really fight corruption, you would need a strong rule of law. You would need not a campaign that comes out every few years, but you would need some consistent rules and accountability, and you would need a free media. You would need democratic elections. Even in democracies, you have corruption, but there are certain limits on how bad it can get if you have these checks and balances. But in China, those things are still not well developed enough.
I know the focus of the class is China and the United States, but one of the significant factors is Russia. What role will Russia play in this thing that's going on between the United States and China?
Repeat the question.
So she's pointing out that Russia is a significant player, and one of the things that people have sometimes worried about is whether you know, Russia and China will gang up against the U.S. And in fact, there have been Russia and China have collaborated on some things and have moved closer together in recent years. But usually, it doesn't go as far as people fear because they do have conflicting interests and they don't really trust each other. One of the things that dampens U.S.-China rivalry to some extent is that we're separated by a huge ocean, right? So we're less directly threatening to each other. China and Russia have one of the longest land borders in the world, and you know, in the 60s and 70s, you know, the Soviet Union had like huge numbers of troops right across the border, and China was hugely worried about that. And they almost went to war in the late 60s over disputes. And even today, Russia, actually there are more Chinese immigrant workers in Siberia than Russians. And, you know, the Russians worry, if you go to Russia, they'll tell you they worry that this whole sparsely populated but resource-rich part of their country, you know, to the east, is right across the border with one of the world's most densely populated and rapidly rising and military powerful countries. Wants to stop China from just grabbing huge portions of Siberia when it needs the resources. So there's that long-term fear that of China overcoming Russia. So yeah, I think there are times when they're both in having conflict with the U.S. that kind of pushes them together, and they might do some symbolic things. But in the long term, I don't think China and Russia will form, you know, the kind of alliances the U.S. has with its own closest allies. Did you have a question?
I think I just figured it out.
Okay.
Thank you. What's the cost for a higher education to a Chinese student?
Well, if they're going to a state, if they get, first of all, it's kind of reversed there. The public schools are the most prestigious, and the private schools are what you go to if you can't get into the public school. So if there's a lot of competition to get into public schools, especially the top ones. And if you get in public schools, it's the state pays for your education. But there aren't enough slots for everybody who wants to get. So then they go to the private schools, and they pay a lot of money, actually. I don't know how much it would be, but for Chinese wages, it's a lot of money to get a private diploma, and it's considered inferior to the public. That's why a lot of people, a lot of Chinese who, you know, if they're well off, but they don't have the grades or test scores to get into public schools, they might come to the U.S. or Europe or Australia.
Yeah, I wonder on this corruption issue, maybe it's a longer term thing, but I'm not sure I have this term, but I think this long-standing way that she worked with family members and huge networks for folks. And how does that influence corruption? And is this a longer term just way of organizing society and deciding, who's favored and who isn't? Is that still?
One she means relations, and so we're talking about networks of trust. In China, it's kind of interesting because we think of China as a very communal society. In America, it's a very individualistic society. Well, until recent years, actually levels of social trust and interpersonal trust in America were much higher than in China. Why would such an individualistic society have higher levels of interpersonal trust? And our trust levels, by the way, keep plummeting, but, as evidenced by just look around us at how, compare when we were younger to today, levels of social trust is much lower, especially in institutions. But if you think about it, in China, it is a communal society, which means that people their identity and their place in life is very firmly set within the context of their family, the extended family or clan, and their village or locality. Which means that their relations with those networks are probably much deeper than ours are. Okay? And so the levels of trust within those personal networks are very high. But anyone outside those networks, a stranger from another locality, not part of your family, no, first of all, that they have very deep loyalties and trust to other people who are not part of your network. And you know that you are outside of their network, and therefore they're going to put people inside their network ahead of you. If there is any, question about priorities. So actually Chinese are quite loyal within their networks, but their networks are only extend so far, and anyone outside their networks is not well trusted. So it's very difficult to form arm's length, transactions in a marketplace. Instead, you will tend to want to do business with people within your network, and you'll be distrustful of doing business outside your network. One of the things is that it's often been hard for Chinese businesses to grow past their founders. The U.S., Ford Motor Company or, U.S. Steel, but Carnegie, you'd have these family dynasties that would create the corporations, but eventually they would go public. And they would have stockholders, and they would have professional management, and it would pass along and grow far beyond the family firm. In China, that step where the family gives up control and allows outsiders to own stock, allows outsiders to come in and manage, that's a more difficult one, right? Because that means trusting strangers. And so often there's a limit on how big family firms grow. Once they get big enough where they need to go public, they can't make that step. So, but Americans, their trust isn't based purely upon family or clan or locality, and therefore we're okay with trusting. We trust people online for goodness sake. We go online and enter our credit card information, and like, that's okay. Give it to whoever. That's more trusting.
Yeah, China has made inroads in Africa, as well as certain parts of Latin America, mainly in Africa. And is that a neo-colonialist approach towards the...
We had Joaquin Chissano here a few years ago. He's the former president of Mozambique. And someone asked him about this thing. He said, well, you know what? the World Bank and IMF and the USAID, and when they come in and they want to, help us with development, they have all these conditions. First of all, they tell us what we need, and then they get all these conditions. The Chinese just come and say, "You tell us what you want," and then no conditions, we'll just build it. Of course, there's implicit conditions, but they're winning political favor, et cetera. But I think in Africa you find a lot of differences over this. Some people think that they're bringing big investment. Certainly, China's need for raw materials led to a huge commodity boom that led to, during the 2000s, the first decade of this century, led to much higher growth in Africa, many African countries. And they are building infrastructure, et cetera. But on the other hand, some of the investment is mainly building a palace for a president, or which then has based on loans that have to be paid back, and then debt. And also you have things like the Chinese will come in and build a road, but they bring in their own workers. They don't hire locally, and then that creates all kinds of problems. So I think it's a mixed bag, but I don't. If the assumption is that the Western investors are always good and do things right in the interest of the Africans and the Chinese don't, I think that's too stark a difference.
Follow up on his question. What happens when they can't pay back the debt?
Right. So, like right now, the commodity boom is reversed. So now Africa is getting terrible prices for its commodities, and some of the loans they took out to finance, mines and ports and things like that may not pay off. So Africa still has an economic structure that's given to boom and bust cycles. And that would be true whether China was involved or not, but Chinese investment may exaggerate the swings.
Trump's tweet, tell us your thoughts on the Chinese regarding that.
So I think China played an interesting, they played this very interesting. As you recall, what happened is that President Tsai Ing-wen from Taiwan, who is a member of a party that advocates independence from China. China doesn't like the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan. She called Donald Trump and had a 10-minute telephone conversation to congratulate him on his triumph. Later it came out, first we thought, well, maybe this was just a spur of the moment thing, he was taking all these calls, and he didn't know any better. And in fact, the Chinese government kind of they kind of pretended like they bought into that interpretation, right? That, well, this is bad, we don't like this, we're going to protest, but, maybe he didn't know any better, and, he's being poorly advised or whatever. They actually blamed the Taiwanese president for it. Right? Most of their fire was aimed at Taiwan's president, who obviously did know what she was doing. I think that was done in part because they weren't sure what this meant, and they wanted to avoid an escalation at this point, and he's not yet president, and they're still trying to get a read on him. But I think they probably understood the reality, which is that, according to Washington Post, he has advisors around him who are hawkish on China and are pro-Taiwan, and have been, that this moment, this call, has been discussed for months. This was planned. This was deliberate.
How'd they get his phone number?
They both have people who. No, but they have people. Yeah, they have people who can do that. And so I think I think this was deliberate. His tweets afterwards did not apologize or say, "Oops," you know, just far from it. They were actually more provocative. So we're left to guess what's going on, but I have a theory, and my theory is that China's become more assertive on certain issues, especially in the South China Sea. And I think that there are advisors to Trump who feel that Obama was not tough enough with China and was not responding in a way that would give China reason to think twice about the next step in escalating South China Sea or maybe elsewhere. And one of the kind of fairly settled, aspects of U.S.-China relations has been this position that the U.S. has about Taiwan, which we'll talk about later in our third session. I won't go into it now, but let's just say that there's been a sort of set of expectations both sides have had about how the U.S. will behave, how China will behave, how Taiwan will behave, and it's everybody's kind of reluctant to unsettle any of that. I think what Trump is trying to signal is, hey, I'm going to unsettle that. You think this is all settled and that you can do whatever you want in South China Sea or elsewhere, and it's not going to have any repercussions for something that you care about, which is Taiwan? No. That's everything's up in the air now. You cause trouble in South China Sea, we can cause trouble in Taiwan. And I think there's that. Now, is that a wise game to play? We'll talk about that in our third session. There's sort of two questions I have. One is it a good idea or smart strategy in principle or in theory? And then the second is, even if you were to argue that it has some merits in principle, are Trump and the people around him the right people to implement that particular strategy with subtlety and nuance and careful deliberation? Well, we don't actually have a Secretary of State yet, so we don't really know.
Great.